Interactions between people from various parts of the globe are a common occurrence in the 21st century. But though more infrequent in the late 18th and early 19th century, cross-cultural interactions in that time had a decisive impact, as we shall explore in this special episode of the Presidencies of the United States. Welcome, dear listener. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. To help us explore this topic, we have a special guest for this episode. Jeffrey Einboden received his PhD from Cambridge University in 2005 and is currently Presidential Research, Scholarship, and Artistry Professor at Northern Illinois University. A specialist in the literatures and languages of early America and the Middle East, Einboden is author of several monographs, including Islam and Romanticism, which was published by One World in 2014, The Islamic Lineage of American Literary Culture, published by Oxford University Press in 2016, The Quran and Kerygma, published by Equinox in 2019, and most recently, Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, the lost story of enslaved Africans, their Arabic letters, and an American president, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. A 2017 Fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, Einboden has also held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, including a 2011 award supporting his recovery, translation, and teaching of Arabic slave writings. It is his latest book, Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, which was the main topic of our conversation. So without further ado, let's get to the interview. So, Jeff, to get us started, as the title suggests, the two main points of connection with the various subjects discussed in your book are Thomas Jefferson and slavery. So that seemed like the perfect place to kind of launch our conversation. You describe Jefferson's, quote, engagement with slavery in Muslim Africa as being, quote, aptly framed by discretion and delay, silence and secrecy, intrigue and anxiety. Can you elaborate a little on this and also share whether this type of engagement with the subject of slavery was common in white American culture in Jefferson's time, or is Jefferson going outside of the norm and engaging with these subjects?
Wonderful question. Well, first of all, Jerry, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Let me say that first. Some of the kind of assonant terms that you're putting together really reflect the contradictions and tensions which are at the center of kind of Jefferson's psyche regarding slavery. And much of that language comes from, I think, the second chapter of the book, where Jefferson is serving as envoy in Paris. And even while his household back home in Virginia is populated and kept by enslaved persons, he is dealing with quote-unquote white Christian slave in Muslim North Africa, Richard O'Brien. And it puts him in this very strange and ironic position of attempting to free someone who is enslaved in Muslim lands, in Muslim African lands, even while having people of African descent enslaved at home. And so that you have this kind of irreconcilable tension, which in some ways leads to these moments of secrecy and silence, reticence, that the Sphinx, the Jefferson's great kind of reputation as the Sphinx, would like to pass over, but he cannot. He's demanded in part of his ambassadorial duties to deal with an American enslaved abroad. And so that's really the beginning where I start the story of Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, which kind of unfolds for the next 40 years, where Jefferson is always balancing between these issues of engagement and being elusive on the question of slavery. Of course, Jefferson is known as the one of great contradiction on, the horrific, peculiar institution of America, both championing individual rights and even seeming a kind of proto-abolitionist, and yet in his public stance, and yet privately benefiting and growing up and perpetuating slavery. And so that kind of tension proceeds over the 40 years that are covered by the book, which center in eventually 20 years after his attempt to free Richard O'Brien in the October of 1807, when he receives Arabic writings by two Muslims enslaved in Western Kentucky.
Absolutely. And that was one fascinating thing in reading your book, is just how much there was to the subject and how many figures and how many pieces of presidential history kind of fed into the story that deals with some characters and individuals that either are rarely discussed or have not been discussed until now. And you already mentioned one of the individuals that I had here, Richard O'Brien, but also William Eden is another American. You mentioned both of them in the course of your work as kind of adopting aspects of Muslim culture due to their interactions with Muslim nations and the Muslim world. What prompted you to include them in this discussion, and what specifically do you think that their experiences can do to help your readers understand the larger themes of the work?
That's wonderful. I mean, in some ways, they're successor figures. Richard O'Brien is in Muslim North Africa, quote unquote, the Barbary States before Eton. And Richard O'Brien, as being an enslaved American in Muslim North Africa, captured while captaining a Philadelphian ship called the Dauphin. Yeah, he's put into Algerian prison and becomes really representative for his crew. That over the next decade, many of whom die in captivity. He is retained in Barbary slavery for upwards of a decade. He used to sign his letters in the U.S. press, a slave in Barbary for 10 years, 4 months, or something like that. So he held that as a badge. But ironically, even though it was his claim to grievance, also in Muslim North Africa, he came to a kind of great respect for the languages and cultures that he found there. And one of the things that I found most surprising about when I was researching O'Brien in relationship to Jefferson, as O'Brien is this catalyst for Jefferson to be thinking about the Muslim world while he's an ambassador in Paris, is that in O'Brien's own manuscript diary, he starts to write snippets of Arabic. And it's not included in the book, but I also found snippets of Arabic also in his letters, and so one of the reproduced manuscripts in the book is the first page of Richard O'Brien's Algerian diary, in which he signs his name and claims the one thing that he owns, yes, as a slave. But he starts it with the same words that begin the Quran, just Bismillah, in the name of Allah, in the name of God. And so it's a very strange and odd kind of tutelage that he receives during his own enslavement. And he rises because he learns the languages and cultures to become the consul, the American consul in the Barbary States once he's freed. And so there's a quite an amazing ambivalence. And then maybe this is jumping up a little too far, but once Jefferson does receive Muslim slave writings in America in 1807, there's one name that occurs to him to apply to for help to try to translate these Arabic writings penned in Western Kentucky by Muslim slaves, and that is Richard O'Brien. And so by the middle of the story of the book, he's put into a completely opposite position where he's a free man in Philadelphia again, and yet he is receiving enslaved writings by now Muslims in America instead of an American in Muslim lands. Eden is a fascinating figure, and he goes through many different stages in the American mind, and some of them honorable, and some of them perhaps a little bit less honorable. But he's right in the crux of so many of the dramas that are playing out in the 1790s and the first decade of the 19th century. He's an adept of Timothy Pickering. Not a big friend of Jefferson. He works with Pickering in his early life, working in quote unquote Indian country with Native North Americans, learning Native North American languages, and that eventually allows him to rise up by the beginning of Jefferson's presidency to pick really any position that he wants, and he wants something in North Africa. He's a major figure in the First Barbary War from 1801 to 1805. He's the hero of To the Shores of Tripoli. He undertakes that mythic 500 or 600 mile trek from Alexandria, Egypt, to Derna, and to sue for peace. Really, what Eden wants is to overturn the regime in Tripoli, but eventually that ends up leading to peace. Much to Eden's chagrin, he wants an overturn in the government of Tripoli in between 1803 and 1805. Jefferson, being once more much more balanced, ambiguous, instead decides for peace rather than fulfilling some of the American commitments to replace the current Pasha, Yusuf Karamanli, with his brother Hamid. And Hamid becomes one of the Muslim fugitives of the book. He's sent off into exile into Egypt and Tunis. And Eden comes back to America, William Eden, very bittered by that process. He had made a lot of promises in Barbary that were not kept up, in his mind, by the Jefferson administration. That all leads finally to his return to the Eastern Seaboard, Washington, D.C., where he's attendant to the first Muslim ambassador to the United States, the first Muslim envoy to the United States, someone named Suleiman Melli, who comes from Tunis at the end of 1805. And Eaton finally finds himself also amidst the Burr conspiracy that I know the podcast I don't believe has reached up to yet, but I'm sure will occupy much. It's one of the most fascinating, I think, stories of the first decade of the 19th century, in which I deal with, in a few chapters in Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives. Eaton is one of the folks that Aaron Burr approaches to try to seduce into helping him take over the Western territories of the United States and found a new empire. And so Eaton, again, just like Richard O'Brien in this kind of ironic overturn an envelope, becomes a figure that was overturning Muslim governments in the Barbary Coast in Barbary Africa, and then is attempted to be seduced by a former vice president of the United States to overturn governments in America itself.
Absolutely. And we are going to be covering quite a few of those subjects very soon on the podcast, so stay tuned.
Yeah.
That was a nice sneak preview for folks of what's to come.
Yeah. Well, and of course, that same episode involved, one of your favorite people. Now I know this is Edward Preble.
Yes.
And I mean, one of the interesting things about the kind of intermixing of identities that is happening in that first half of the first decade of the 19th century is when this Tunisian ambassador arrives I think he shows up at the White House on November 30th, 1805, Suleiman Melli. He stays in the United States for almost a year. He doesn't depart Boston until the following autumn. But during that time, he meets a young man named Samuel Harris, this is not in the book, who is able to greet him in Arabic. He shows up to his hotel in Boston and blesses him and greets him in Arabic and gives him his peace in Arabic. And Melli is fascinated by this. This same Samuel Harris, who is a young kind of prodigy of Oriental languages, will be the same artist who also draws Preble's sketch, his portrait, that ends up being in his obituary publication by John Kirkland.
Wow.
And yeah, so there's these fascinating kind of interweaving figures. Again, this isn't part of the book, but that go between Muslim North Africa and America and back, and there's this kind of continual circulation with a kind of tight cast of characters.
Hey, podcast listeners, I'm Paul Brandis introducing my podcast, Countdown to Dallas. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the seemingly unconnected events that led to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. It's based on my book of the same title. In that book and in this podcast, I go all the way back to 1939, when Lee Harvey Oswald was born into a troubled and dysfunctional family. I'll follow his transient and often violent teenage years and young adulthood, painting a fuller picture of the man who would later become Kennedy's killer. I also take a look at events unfolding in that era, like Cuba and Vietnam, and I'll unpack the conspiracy theories too, not one of which has ever been conclusively proven. Subscribe to Countdown to Dallas at evergreenpodcasts.com or your favorite listening app, October 31st.
Well, and it's interesting. I was actually just having a conversation with somebody this weekend about, how interlaced these relationships were, and so many people in conversation with one another and in so many wide geographies. I mean, it's really fascinating when you start to follow these threads and just see the connections. Since you mentioned him, let's stay with Melli for a minute, because you had mentioned when he arrived in Washington, D.C., it was around the same time that a delegation of Native peoples had arrived from west of the Mississippi River. That was part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, making contact with these individuals and asking them to go back and meet with Jefferson in D.C. Would you mind sharing how both Melli and the Native peoples were received by both the Jefferson administration and just Washington society in general? And what do you think this tells us about how Native nations and Muslim nations, respectively, were viewed by white Americans at that time?
Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating, and as far as I know, it's entirely providential coincidence. But as you've been tracing through in the podcast, the kind of simultaneity of the Barbary Coast expeditions and engagements and violence with the Western expansion. I mean, this is happening at the very same time, 1801 to 1805, and particularly 1803, 4, and 5, right? So the kind of culminates in my mind, as you suggest, that by the end of 1805, you have two delegations arrive. You have one delegation from Tunis, from Tunisia, and one delegation from west of the Mississippi, one of Native Americans, the latter and the former being Muslim North Africans. They receive a very similar reception and similar characterization. And so we would expect that, I suppose, so that we get, shameful words like barbarian being thrown around, not only by Americans, but by British attachés like Augustus Foster. But something kind of more interesting, I think, than, the expected bigotry of kind of white America is the reaction between the engagement between actual Muslim North Africans and Native Americans that happened during this time. So Jefferson is hosting dinners in December of 1805, a kind of famous dinner that he hosts at the end of the first week of December for Melly Melny. In the invitations that go out for that dinner, he says, we're not going to eat until sundown, basically. And one of these invitations goes to none other than John Quincy Adams, a future president, a future engager with Muslim North Africa, as we might discuss later. And he does this. He asks for a kind of a late seating time and time to repast because it's Ramadan. Yes, and so it's out of respect for the Muslim envoys. During the same kind of time, there's parties, New Year's parties that by the end of the year, at the beginning of 1806, and this is where the Native Americans and Muslims are together in the same room. And the reports, there are several reports, so one would maybe think that they're apocryphal, but there's several reports that kind of give us a sense of a cloud of witnesses that this is true. That when Melny Melny, the envoy from Tunis, saw the Native Americans, he recognized what, in his mind, kindred peoples. So there was cultural attachments, ways of behavior and mores that the Muslim North Africans saw in the Native Americans, and he claims that the Native Americans were the sons of Ishmael, just as the Muslim North Africans, Ishmael being the progenitor of Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. And so we have this sense of kind of, yes, white America seeing this kind of barbarian, quote unquote, otherness in both the Muslim North Africans and the Native Americans, and yet also a kind of kinship, at least from the perspective of the Barbary envoys. And so that it's a kind of interesting collision between these kind of pre-Anglo-American moments coming together. And it's facilitated in, New Year's parties that Jefferson is hosting at the president's house.
Absolutely. And it is fascinating to see so many different cultures coming together. And to me, that part of your book it does represent kind of a microcosm of what was going on a larger scale. Thinking from the American perspective as the nation was expanding and encountering new native peoples, but then also expanding its influence abroad. But then you also do get this in American relations with certain peoples. It wasn't seen as being the same as, relations with Britain and France. And
no, not at all. And there's also, this kind of link between Native Americans or Native America. So the territories originally occupied by Native Americans in North Africa goes back very early in Jefferson's own career. I mean, one of the, 20 years before Lewis and Clark, there was John Ledyard, who Jefferson had wanted to map the expanse of the American West. And instead of trying to get John Ledyard to go from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, he wanted Ledyard to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic. So from Russia, get through Russia, arrive in Nootka Sound, and then go down and proceed on to in the direction of east to the Atlantic. That wasn't possible. Ledyard eventually was arrested by Catherine the Great and was impeded in his travels through Russia. But instead of mapping the American expanse, he decided to instead go to North Africa, and that's where he died. So the first apostle of of mapping for Jefferson into the American West, and eventually dies in Muslim North Africa. And so, I mean, this is kind of a collision, tension, expanse that is in Jefferson's mind right from the 1780s. With that, Jefferson sent him from Paris. So,
absolutely, it was fascinating to really get a sense of all of those different links, of all those different instances of these connections with so many different peoples, because, you had mentioned William Eden, as well as originally being involved with relations with Native Americans and then going and ending up in North Africa. One of the things that I wanted to ask you, because the written word is kind of a key thread that runs through your work. And especially I was thinking of the account of the life and enslavement of Ibrahim Abd al-Rahman. You discussed how, quote, his literacy in Arabic had gained him his liberty. And in various instances, you discuss enslaved individuals who could write Arabic. Would you mind elaborating on kind of the interplay between enslavement and literacy and how the Arabic language was perceived by non-Muslims? And then also kind of the role of language and literacy in the Muslim world.
Yes. I think this is the absolute critical pressure point of the entire book. And this is why Jefferson becomes the kind of gravitational center of these three stories. So the book tells three stories of enslaved Muslims in the early U.S. spanning the 1780s and the 1820s. And the middle story that kind of includes them both is Jefferson's receipt of Muslim slave writings in 1807. Jefferson forms the chronological center of the book in this way, but it also forms the kind of conceptual center. Right? For Jefferson, liberty and literacy, or liberty and language, go together. And of course, the First Amendment, which Jefferson did not write, but yet takes its cue from Jeffersonian principles that we can see in the Virginian Statute for Religious Freedom that he was so proud of, right? It becomes the first lines of his epitaph, right? So, in Monticello, if you go to the west side of Monticello, there's his grave, and there's only, three things that he's proud of. And one of them is the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom that connects together the idea of expression and liberation or emancipation. And so for Jefferson, in his ambivalent, fraught, and often horrific track record with enslavement, one of the exceptions that we have that the book pushes is this moment of encountering enslaved peoples who are from Africa who are able to write, yes, and they're able to write a language that he cannot read. And so these enslaved people, in fact, make our most intellectually invested early founding father himself illiterate. And so there's a sense of humility that I think is brought in with this, and this is why eventually, Jefferson elects to be a hesitant and conditional advocate for these two enslaved Africans of Muslim confession because of the technique of writing. Now that's very problematic for us, I think, because that every human being has infinite worth and value, whether one is literate or not. But in the mind of Jefferson and the way in which the Enlightenment mind in particular worked, literacy, liberty, language, expression, and emancipation, all of these things were connected very, very deeply. And this also applies to both of the stories that kind of surround Jefferson in 1807. The book reveals the first act of Arabic slave writings in the newly formed United States, which I located in 1788 in Georgia seacoast. And in that moment, the only reason that singular enslaved person was noticed, and his name was Osman, writing Arabic just south of Savannah on a place called Parnassus Plantation. The only reason that we're able to recover, that I'm able to recover the name in the book, is because of an act of writing. So he garners attention by, it happens to be a New England elite named Abiel Holmes, the father of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Sr. and Jr., yes, and also a correspondent with Jefferson himself. He finds this enslaved person who is able to write, and it's an absolute dazzling experience for him. I mean, he writes in this kind of hyperbolic divine language about this enslaved West African who can write a language that even the most elite at the proto-Ivy League cannot read. Yes. And this happens you mentioned Ibrahim Abdul Rahman, who played a role in the 1828 election of John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Quincy Adams, during his presidency, with the help of Henry Clay, helps to emancipate this man who had been enslaved in Natchez for 40 years, and he could still write Arabic. But he comes to the notice of even the President of the United States, later President, the surrogate boy of Thomas Jefferson himself, because of his act of writing. And he, of all of the enslaved Muslims in the book, is the one that's able to procure freedom. Of course, his story ends tragically. He's sent back to Africa. He only makes it to Liberia and not back to the Senegambia from where he had originally come. But it kind of makes this envelope that, yes, there's a distinction in the actual language that is appealing very much to this kind of Enlightenment and Romantic America, where it's really the only thing that can pierce some of the kind of hard-headed prejudices that are very much at play in the 1790s and the first couple of decades of the 19th century.
Absolutely. And
there's even posters from that 1828 election where Jackson, takes the presidency in 1829 and leaves John Quincy Adams just a one-term president, like his father. And there's even, electioneering posters that Jackson is using Adams Jr., his advocacy for this this Muslim slave, to his benefit, to try to get the slaveholding plantation owners to vote for Jackson against Adams, because Adams is clearly someone who has sympathy for enslaved Muslims.
Absolutely. And it was fascinating, that interplay between, the instances of enslaved individuals, of writing, and then this political element, and you see that, and I think you portrayed that quite well with Jefferson trying to be very cautious about, what he did with the two individuals that he knew of in Kentucky, and John Quincy Adams also likewise having to make some decisions and how this would have impacted him politically. The politics of it are always an important element to consider, and we see that in numerous instances that you talk about. And one of the, go ahead.
Yeah, Jared. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And it goes back to your original point about the idea of secrecy and coding and reticence and silence. Because to be honest, some of the white politicians of the early 19th century would pay a price for even showing humanity to other human beings who were enslaved. And so this is a horrific irony. But I think this also leads to some of the reason why these stories have stayed silent for 200 years. And this kind of, at the end of the book, it jumps forward somewhat, because the last main figure of the book to collect Abdul Rahman's writings before he goes is sent back to Africa tragically to die is Edward Everett. And Edward Everett is this great figure that kind of balances all of these nuances and intentions. He's the last person that Jefferson ever writes the word slavery to in a letter. In April 1826, he's the president of Harvard eventually. He's the governor of Massachusetts eventually. But he's also an Arabic student. So he studies Arabic in Göttingen in Germany during his PhD in his youthful years, sent there partly with his friend George Stickner, sent by Jefferson to buy some more books after selling his books to the Library of Congress. And Everett studies Arabic. He gathers this kind of Arabic knowledge only to come back to the United States and meet in the U.S. Capitol a man who speaks Arabic, writes Arabic beautifully, Everett says, who has been enslaved in the United States for 40 years, or in the Americas, only recently into the United States for 40 years. And then, of course, it's Everett who gives the Gettysburg Address in November of 1863. So we usually think about the iconic 2-minute speech of Abraham Lincoln, but the real Gettysburg Address was Edward Everett's, which was 2 hours before Lincoln got up and gave his iconic Gettysburg Address that quotes Jefferson, "All men created equal." And so even at the height of the Civil War, you have someone who's an Arabist with Lincoln at this iconic moment in the midst of the nation tearing itself apart. who has had engagements with Muslim slaves. And then the very end of the book, I draw the line right till 1999 with Al Gore's. Al Gore launches his presidential campaign in 1999 at the steps of the Carthage courthouse, which is the last known place that we know that the Muslim slaves, the enslaved Muslims that spoke to Jefferson in Arabic were. So by that time, we're 200 years almost away from that moment that Jefferson had, and those writings had never been recovered. And as Al Gore is, attempting to win the presidency in a failed bid that will be defined by 9/11, of course, when the victor of the election gets into office, George W. Bush. It's ironic that it's the very same place in American geography, and yet those traces, those ghosts from the past, are entirely silenced. And so the book attempts to kind of bring those back, to reinscribe to those kind of iconic places now of American politics or thought, those stories in Arabic lines that we've forgotten.
Absolutely. Well, and that is one thing, and especially with the podcast. Again, I was having some conversations this weekend with folks about just how far-reaching history can be, and the ties of history, and we really do see these interplays of writings, of secrecy, of politics, and of fear, of otherness that continue on into the present day. And we really, I think that's a way that readers can connect to your book is in seeing these common threads that are still very much present in people from various backgrounds.
That's true. And a lot of the business of forgetting was done before us. So even those who, want to find out about these things, they're often buried. But the interesting thing about the materials that form Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives is that they were hiding in plain sight for 200 years. So that there were these secret documents, but they were in the papers of the most prominent peoples, white men of the early republic. So Ezra Stiles, who was the president of Yale during the Revolution, he has the most rich Arabic slave writings in his papers, and they've just never been recovered, because I think most archivists just simply don't know what this is, and then they put it in a corner. And the same with Jefferson. I mean, I mentioned in the prologue of the book that I've been teaching Arabic slave writings for several years at Northern Illinois University and teaching Jefferson alongside of them. But I was entirely ignorant that there was an actual link between these things until I started doing the archival work for this book, which started about 10 or 11 years ago. And so we can be forgiven, I think, for not knowing these things, because they've been buried under generational, both kind of intentional and unintentional acts of forgetting.
Absolutely. And this kind of brings me to another point, because, this idea of, even nowadays with scholars who don't necessarily understand Arabic, and you encounter a sample of Arabic in archives, what do you do with it? And so you talked about at one point the treaty between the U.S. and Tripoli, and Joel Barlow's translation work, and how there were inconsistencies between the translated version and the original Arabic treaty that you were able to kind of explore a bit, and in particular with Article 11. And I was wondering if you could talk about that for a minute, and then kind of share the significance of this and what it might tell us about American relations with Muslim nations of that time.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, this was one of my favorite moments in writing the book and researching for the book. I mean, so much of the book is dedicated to fleshing out the context in Jefferson's life for his receipt of these enslaved Muslim documents that he receives in 1807, and trying to draw out the context and the atmosphere that makes them make sense. And my claim is throughout the book that once he opens these documents in 1807, he recognizes them immediately. He doesn't recognize what they say, but he recognizes this instance of literacy. And the reason why he does this is that in Paris, first with Thomas Berkeley and the treaty with Morocco, which Jefferson signs at the beginning of the year of 1787, he's receiving documents in Arabic, treaties in Arabic. He's also buying books in Arabic and developing friendships with great Arabists like the Comte de Volnay in Paris. And so he's getting all of this kind of context that will make the receipt of Arabic slave writings in 1807 make sense. On the way from that, in between those two moments, is the Treaty of Tripoli that is translated. I'm putting in quotes if in the podcast, Jerry can see me, but I'm putting in quotes, translated by Joel Barlow, which has been extremely contentious because of its, as you said, its Article 11. So like any other American treaty with the Muslim world, the Treaty of Amity with Morocco or something, it probably, it's important, but very few folks, except for specialists, would be interested. Not the Treaty of Tripoli that Joel Barlow produces, because of its Article 11 that makes a bold claim. And the Article 11 begins something like, whereas it's in this kind of presupposition mode, but whereas the government of the United States is in no way based on the Christian religion. Okay. And this was done in the English version was done in 1796, I believe, and then it was ratified by the Adams government in 1797. I mean, so it's completely signed off with that Article 11 in there. And of course, it's been a contentious statement all the way through, and happening within a treaty with a Muslim world in particular makes it incendiary, no matter where one stands in religious debate. One of the long-standing kind of assumptions for the 20th century was that there was no such thing as an Article 11 in the original treaty, and that Joel Barlow, who was a great Francophile, a revolutionary figure in France for the French Revolution, that he basically makes this up and kind of channels Thomas Paine, channels Jefferson to put this kind of anti-Christian sentiment into this Muslim treaty. I was able to recover in Barlow's own papers, though, the original of the treaty, or what I believe is the original of the treaty, and it does very much clearly have an Article 11. The crux, though, is, or the hookup is, that it doesn't say that. It does not say that the government of the U.S. is in no way founded on the Christian religion, but it does emphasize precisely what is in Joel Barlow's, the rest of that article in the treaty, which is that Muslims and Americans, and we can take as read Christians in this context, have mutual sacred significance. Okay, so in the Arabic, the words that is used for an American in Tripoli and someone from Tripoli in America is that they're harama, the mahrum. They have this sense of sacredness. Harama in Arabic has this sense of sometimes taboo, sacred, sacrosanct. And so we could say, if you just in a secular way translate it, could be just that they're safe from any violence, sacrosanct in that way, but it has much more of a kind of religious tinge to it. And this is, I think, what's happening in the famous Article 11 is that Barlow is thinking about kind of religious amity or harmony between the two places. And just of that is would have been a fairly incendiary in 1797, and perhaps in some quarters today as well.
Absolutely. And and especially thinking of that time and the factional divides that were going on at that time, and religion playing a role in that in the United States. So yeah, you can see why that was that, and even to the present day, the role that religion still plays in American culture and society and politics. You can see why that is so contentious.
Definitely. And it's Article 11 that's been brought up over and over in both sides of the debate in terms of, American religiosity. And of course, it has a definitively political intervention as well, as happening in a treaty ratified by the U.S. government, signed by a U.S. president. So, it has that kind of force to it. The irony, of course, is that it's not in the original Arabic, yes, and it's only in the English. But there is an original. The good news is that the book comes up with it, is that there is an original Arabic of Article 11. It just doesn't correspond precisely, and yet it still has this sense, this religious resonance to it, and that's the claim that I try to make in the book.
Absolutely. Well, and I really enjoy all the context that you kind of frame. You kind of help to put these stories into, helping us to understand kind of in various aspects how Americans and Western Europeans were approaching the Muslim world. And one of the interesting ones that you pointed to was a literary tradition of the time of American and European authors writing about Muslim characters. And you note that this is a tradition that Jefferson was familiar with as he clipped one of the representative poems for his scrapbook. What do you believe that this literary tradition tells us about how these non-Muslims viewed people from Arab nations and the Muslim faith?
Yeah, and it's a wonderful question. I think there's such a diverse literature that grows up in the 18th century and into the early 19th century, where Muslim figures play a central role. Turkish spy novels, these kinds of things. The Turk in Philadelphia, this kind of thing, and there's a lot of different kind of motives behind them. Yes, some of them kind of lead up and echo into something like Uncle Tom's Cabin. Even though it's not specifically dealing with Muslim characters, there's a sense of a kind of polemical, didactic quality where we're attempting to come to terms with an otherness in the 19th century and form sympathy, empathy, those kind of the feeling with the characters. Other times it's much more hostile or a lot less sympathetic. Jefferson himself, this is one of the aspects of Jefferson's career that I think needs to get a little bit more play. Even though, he's thought of as, the enlightened mind, philosopher, legalistic lawyer, and then we have a sense of, a budding scientist, a horticulturalist, Jefferson. There's also Jefferson the literati, yes? And of course, he loves the Greek and Latin classics, but he's much more wide-ranging in his reading and aesthetic interests. And this is partly why at the end of his life, after selling his library to Congress to become the new Library of Congress after the destruction of Washington by the British, that he needs folks to go to Europe and buy him more books and to replenish his stock. And he says, not for instruction any longer, but for entertainment. But for Jefferson, entertainment is a very serious thing. It's a very earnest thing, let's say. Jefferson himself was at the heart of this kind of literary revival of the Muslim world in his translation of a text that is precisely a kind of Muslim land travelogue. And this is a figure that I just mentioned, French Arabist named Comte de Volney. Volney is actually a kind of pseudonym from two different words in French, Voltaire and Vernet. But Volney was this political figure, Arabist, Orientalist, traveler in the Muslim world, and Jefferson and Volney meet in Paris sometime around 1785, 1786. Volney comes back from the Middle East in 1785. Jefferson comes from America in 1784. They meet sometime around then and form a fast relationship and friendship. Volney eventually visits Jefferson. He's one of the fugitives in the book. He's a Muslim invested fugitive. He's not Muslim, but he's interested in Muslim lands. He becomes a fugitive from the Reign of Terror in France and spends time in America with Jefferson. He's one of the figures who makes the connection between Native American languages and Muslim Islamic tongues, Middle Eastern tongues. He draws connections between the Miami Algonquin language and Arabic. As far-fetched as that sounds, he's writing these kinds of things as he's visiting with Jefferson. Together, they form this kind of literary pact, which again is in secret, for Jefferson to translate Volney's travelogue in the Muslim world called The Ruins, or Meditations on the Revolutions of Empire. And Jefferson translates the first 19 chapters of this text, and in translating it, he translates the most core tenets of Islam. He translates the Shahada, there's no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. He translates that, into Jeffersonian English. Yes, these are the kinds of things that we don't usually think of, and it's a very imaginative aesthetic work. It's a meditation on politics, on religion, on history, but it also has a kind of frame narrative that makes it a literary work. And then, of course, the one who translates the rest of the work is none other than Joel Barlow, who so fancifully translated, Article 11 of the treaty they were just speaking about. So these things all work together. But Jefferson is very much in the midst of this as a kind of Middle Eastern literati, which is not really usually the way that we think of him.
Absolutely. And that's That is one thing with studying Jefferson. There are just so many different layers and so many different subjects that you can study Jefferson and
Yes.
whatever.
Yes, right. And I mean, I mentioned this in the prologue. Is that there seems, I mean, it's been said before that there is exactly as you say, Jerry. There's infinite studies that is Jefferson and Jefferson and cuisine, or Jefferson's moose, or a kind of lively, lighter fare, and then also extremely deep, disturbing, challenging texts as well. And so this on Jefferson and studies. And so this was one of the shocks of finding enslaved Muslims. They're the only pieces of writing that these two folks have surviving in Jefferson's own papers, right? So connecting him to another and, but one that's kind of deeply at the heart of the national psyche.
Well, and this idea of hidden messages, whether it's through ciphers that were intended to conceal a communication or messages in a language that were incomprehensible to the reader, this is another thing that really runs through and resonates in your work. And for me, that seems to resonate with this premise of uncovering the hidden story of enslaved Muslims in early American history. So I was just wanting to see if you could speak to what drew you to this topic and what do you hope your readers take away from your work?
Thank you. Well, I came to the field itself in a kind of circuitous way. I'm Canadian, and I did my graduate work in England. So I was at Cambridge for my graduate studies, and so I come to the national tradition in a very kind of international frame, both personally and scholastically. But at the beginning of my career, I started as both a Middle Eastern languages person as well as an early Americanist. And that there's few and far between folks who are doing that together. And this is why there's a kind of profusion or cloud of witnesses of manuscripts that are available to recover, simply because in the early Republic, there were so many figures, particularly at the top of institutions, who were interested in Middle Eastern languages. Hebrew, most obviously, but also Arabic and Persian. I've mentioned a few of them already now, including Jefferson himself. And so these figures collected these manuscripts in Hebrew, Arabic, and Persian, and they've been laying kind of there waiting for discovery. As for as I mentioned, I mean, I didn't know this connection between Jefferson and Muslim slave writings when I began teaching Muslim slave writings. I got a grant from the NEH in 2011 to try to recover as many Arabic documents that had not been discovered so far. And I spent a lot of time in North Carolina and South Carolina. Jerry, I know you know that Davidson College, I think, well.
Oh, yes.
Davidson has some of the greatest riches of Arabic slave writings by someone named Omar ibn Sayyid, who was a slave in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and Wilmington, North Carolina, and lives right until 1863, produces a whole autobiography in Arabic. And so my early work was on Omar ibn Sayyid, who's not featured in this book on Jefferson. But beyond his papers, the predominance, the bulk of the material in Arabic are found amongst these kind of leaders of the early nation. And so one of the things that I think is useful to take away from this, and the idea of literate slaves and literate enslaved persons of Muslim confession, is the idea of overturning the hierarchy of power through literacy that happens in an instant in these engagements. And so, of course, there's a hierarchy of power in terms of physical power, of political power. Those are not overturned, though sometimes they're mediated or mitigated by literacy, as we've talked about. Abdul Rahman finally gets his freedom because of his literacy. But there is an intellectual, cultural overturning of power that's possible through these moments, where these, the folks, Ezra Stiles, Jefferson at the top of institutions, Yale, the U.S. government, find that they are unable to read these texts penned by enslaved Africans. And so that I think the awakening in the American mind had actual material effects in the history of abolition. Ezra Stiles joins in Connecticut an abolitionist society after receiving these documents. Jefferson has this brief conditional contingent moment in finding Muslim slave documents that opens him up to a different possibility that's usually shut down in every other sphere of his life. Edward Everett becomes a devotee of abolition, even giving the Gettysburg Address with Lincoln by 1863, after having an actual encounter with a Muslim slave. And so I think those kinds of overturnings of hierarchy through a different language, of multilingual, and thinking about America in those terms, that's the other kind of bringing together of Native Americans and Muslims from the so-called Barbary Coast, is that America was peopled and engaged and infused with languages and cultures and religions far beyond the more narrow scope that we understandably first allow students to receive, just so that they get the received story. But there's so much else going on in the early republic.
Absolutely. Well, and thinking of kind of this approach and trying to uncover these hidden stories, I wanted to ask you, I imagine that there have been some rather unique challenges that you faced in your research. So I was wondering if you would speak to that for a moment.
Well, I mean, one of the wonderful things about these documents and uncovering them, there's such a eureka moment, and it's in some ways it's very poignant, emotional to find enslaved people's their last written testaments that have been buried for 200 years. But they're few and far between, right? So I have been, spent the last 10, 11 years searching for precisely these kinds of documents. And when they arise, they're more powerful than, one can anticipate. But it takes a lot of searching. Nowadays, it's a lot easier because with the digitized archives, and major archives are being more and more cataloged online, so you can actually go into item level, folder level kind of discretion to find documents, which is absolutely wonderful. But I would say that's been the primary challenge. I mean, I feel extremely blessed that during my student days that I spent my time on Middle Eastern languages in order to prepare myself to be an Americanist. I mean, this is completely unlikely kind of trajectory, but that's really the only possible way for me to have been able to accomplish what I have. So,
and one thing that we've seen in the podcast, and I think just that people see in life, is that sometimes we go down a path and it leads us to places that we never would have imagined. But in many instances, it's a place that has great possibility.
Yes, yeah, and one gets a sense of the kind of the providence of ignorance sometimes, or that even if one had have been able to anticipate, one wonders if one would have embarked not knowing all the challenges. So sometimes not knowing where leading is allows you to get there, I think.
Absolutely. Well, and as we're wrapping up, speaking of where we're going, I was wanting to see if you could speak to, because I read in another interview that you recently gave that you have a couple of new projects that you're working on. Would you mind sharing those with the audience?
Sure. So, Jared, just as you were saying that there's so many different connections with Jefferson, it's kind of endless in the profusion of materials that surround him and his interests. My next project has come up already a couple of times in our discussion, is a study of Native philology, Native American languages in Jefferson, and specifically the role of Orientalism or Middle Eastern language study in the characterization of Native American languages via Jefferson's efforts. And so one of the things that pops up in Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives very briefly in Jefferson's engagements with Ezra Stiles in the 1780s is a discussion of the origins of Native Americans. And Jefferson notes to Stiles that he believes that Asia was peopled from America, not the other way around, right? And so we get this sense of the kind of priority of the Native American in the Middle Eastern Asian world. And so I trace that through in the next project, and thinking specifically how that impacts the linguistics that Jefferson engages through the American Philosophical Society, great figures like Duponceau. So that's what I'm working on right now. And then the next project, it's kind of a companion project, a different kind of successor to Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, is tentatively entitled right now Chains in the Crescent. And it's going to be a study of Islam in the Civil War, and an expose of the Muslim soldiers, veterans, Muslim soldiers and slaves between 1860 1861 and 1865. And also the Islamicate portraits of Lincoln that flew all around in the press during the Civil War. And so it's a kind of bringing up to date, and the next kind of the second war that defines the American in the early Republic from the Revolution, and now it's the kind of companion piece of the Civil War.
Well, I'm very excited to read both. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you for all of your work, and in particular, giving us a new perspective on the early Republic and on the various peoples that populated that world and that have been, in many cases, lost to history. Thank you so much for your work in bringing them back to life and back to light so that we really can have a true appreciation of what the world was and what the world is and what it can be.
Thank you, Jerry. And thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you and to your listeners as well. And
once you're done with your next projects, we hope you'll come back on and talk to us about them.
I would be delighted. And I have to say it's reciprocal, because as I'm listening through the podcast week by week, I'm getting more and more. Your work is absolutely wonderful, and we're all benefiting from it.
Thank you so much. Special thanks to Jeff for agreeing to come on the podcast and share his work and insights with us. If you haven't read it already, I highly recommend that you get a copy of Jefferson's Muslim Fugitives, the lost story of enslaved Africans, their Arabic letters, and an American president. I'd also like to thank Sarah Payne from Oxford University Press for connecting Jeff and me. Without her, this interview could not have happened. Special thanks to the Itinerant Band for allowing us to use clips from their rendition of Jefferson and Liberty as the intro and outro music for this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Jeff Einboden or the Itinerant Band, or check out past episodes, as well as other presidential history resources that I've linked to, go to the website at presidencies.blueberry, that's BLUBRRY.com. This podcast is supported by so many in numerous ways, so I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our patrons. Thanks so much to Matthew, Michelle, Kara, Scott, and our newest patron, Jeremy. It's been great since I launched the site on Patreon earlier this year to see that others shared my enthusiasm for presidential history and were willing to contribute to the work of this podcast through providing financial support, so I can't thank them enough. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, just go to patreon.com/presidencies and sign up. For as little as $1 a month, you can help to ensure that this podcast is able to continue for years to come. If you aren't able to contribute financially, but would still like to support the podcast, there are many ways in which you can do so. Leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Podchaser, or any other platform that has that capability helps to get the word out about the podcast. You can also follow me on social media and share new episodes as they come out. If you're not connected with me on there already, I can be found on Facebook at Presidencies, on Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram at Presidencies Podcast, all one word. If you have a question or would like to send some comments through email, send those on to presidenciespodcast, again, all one word, at gmail.com. Connecting to listeners is one of the greatest joys of podcasting, and I greatly appreciate you taking the time out to listen to episodes and reach out through one of the various means available. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
Welcome to Anthology of Heroes, the podcast that explores the most pivotal moments of history through the eyes of those who lived it. In this podcast, we don't spend our time recounting facts and dates. Instead, we follow in the footsteps of national heroes, kings, or ordinary people who lived and breathed the moments that shaped our world. We're not hemmed in by eras, borders, or religions. Instead, we seek out the tales of those who defied the odds and fought passionately for their beliefs. Whether they're right or wrong is up to you to decide. From Vercingetorix's doomed rebellion against Rome, to Osceola's unshakable war against the USA, all the way up to the inspiring Sobibor concentration camp uprising in World War II, each episode is an immersive listening experience, blending music and sound effects to really draw you into the story. Our episodes go for about 45 minutes, making them perfect for your commute, and are crafted using a wealth of historical sources which I list on our website if you want to learn more. I'm the host, Elliot Gates, and I'm thrilled to have you joining me as we uncover history's hidden gems and illuminate the faded pages of our past. Look out for the Anthology of Heroes podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, or anywhere else you get your podcasts from.